All right, in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 1 to 3, Peter speaks of the false teachers who were predicted, but who are now among those to whom Peter is writing. And he says that they secretly bring in damning heresies. And as a result, they're bringing damnation on themselves. The judgment that was planned for these false teachers from long ago, he says that judgment has not been suspended or set aside, but rather that judgment is on course. Despite their claim, the false teachers' claim, as we see in chapter 3, that the judgment wasn't coming based on how long it's taken Christ. That he's been gone so long. Where's this coming that he promised? So despite their claiming that this judgment is not going to happen, no. The judgment is on course, and they are in fact going to be judged. And in chapter 2, verse 4 through the first part of verse 10, that's where we were when we ended 2 weeks ago. Peter contrasts in those verses the fates of the rebellious and the godly. And as I said, right when we ended, Peter makes his points through an extended if-then formula. Okay, he says, if, which as is true, okay, these things that he's citing are accepted as true. So he says, if, as is true, God cast certain sinful angels into Tartarus to be held for judgment. If, as is true, God flooded the world of ungodly people, but protected Noah. If, as is true, God incinerated Sodom and Gomorrah as an example of what's coming to the ungodly, and he rescued Lot. If those things are true, which they are, well then certain things follow from that. There are certain conclusions that follow from that. At least two things can be concluded. That God is quite capable of rescuing the godly from a trial, and he's likewise capable of holding the unrighteous for punishment in the day of judgment. So those three things that he's given, those illustrations that he's given, demonstrate that God is quite capable of bringing the godly through a trial, through punishment, and he's quite capable of holding the unrighteous for punishment in the day of judgment. Now, the fact God knows how to rescue the godly person from a trial or a judgment, how to bring the faithful through the sifting event of divine judgment without destruction, well, that's an encouragement to the faithful. That's an encouragement to those who believe in the coming judgment, contrary to the false teachers who are denying that Christ is coming. He's not coming back. If he was coming, he'd have come by now. So they deny that he's coming in judgment, but it's an encouragement to the faithful, those who believe he is coming. There is no chance. He's letting them know that there is no chance that the coming judgment will be indiscriminate. There's no chance it will be indiscriminate, that it will take the righteous with the wicked. So there's every reason for the faithful, for the people to whom he's writing, there's every reason for them to resist the false teacher's encouragement to join in immoral living, to become unrighteous. Okay? There's no chance that it's going to suck up the righteous with the ungodly. So there's every reason for you to continue to resist the false teacher's appeal to you to join them in immoral living. Now, the flood from which Noah was protected and the incineration of the cities from which Lot was rescued, those were acts of divine judgment. And Peter ties the word trial. It was just interesting to me that he's talking about divine judgment, but he refers to it as a trial. And you can see he ties the word trial to the judgment from which Lot was spared, and he does that by repeating the word rescue. You see, he says that God rescued righteous Lot from the incineration of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? So this is the judgment that's falling on those people. He rescued him from that trial, and thus he knows how to rescue godly people from a trial. So he's referring to the divine judgment. He's classifying it or describing it as a trial from which the godly will be rescued. Okay, so judgment here, he refers to it as a trial. So I think what he's talking about here is that the righteous will come through that sifting event, that final judgment. He's talking about the final judgment at Christ's return. He describes it as a trial because they will come through that judgment that will fall at Christ's return. They will come through that unscathed. They will be saved and delivered from that. And if you remember it in 1 Peter, I know you won't remember, but maybe. But in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 17, Peter indicates that in the persecution of Christians, he says there in 1 Peter 4:17 that God is beginning his judgment of humanity starting from the church. So he characterizes the persecution that the church is experiencing as the beginning of God's judgment of humanity. And whereas the purpose of that judgment, in terms of the church, he says it is a test. It is to test them. It is to allow the genuineness and the purity of their faith to shine through. The purpose of that judgment, of divine judgment that began from the church in 1 Peter 4:17, the purpose of that judgment, when it later falls in its finality, when it later falls as the final judgment at Christ's return, well, he then applies the notion of testing to the final judgment in terms of the church, because as I say, the righteous are rescued. Just as the judgment from the church in 1 Peter 4:17 is a testing, in that it's an opportunity for the righteousness and purity of the faith of the church to shine through, he characterizes the final judgment that way. And I think he does that. He refers to that divine judgment as a trial or a test, because it also will be a time when the purity of the faith of God's people shines through in their coming through unscathed. They come through the sifting event. Okay, so that's maybe a long way to go about the trial, but it just interested me to why he's referring to the final judgment as a test or a trial. And I think that's what's going on there. Now, Lot, he describes Lot as righteous Lot. And Lot was not without fault, but you say, well, where's this characterization of Lot as righteous? Where's this coming from? And Lot, his righteousness is implied in the Genesis account by Abraham's declaration in Genesis 18, verse 25, that the Lord does not destroy the righteous with the wicked. And then we have Lot's subsequent rescue from Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 19. So it's his righteousness is implied. God does not destroy the righteous with the wicked, and then Lot is spared. So you have the implication that Lot is righteous, and his righteousness is also implied in his being the only one in the city who offered hospitality to the visiting angels, and his defending the visiting angels, whatever one thinks of his offering his daughters in that cause. But his righteousness is implied in his offering hospitality to the visiting angels and his defending them when the entire town insisted that he turn over the angelic visitors for sexual relations. So his righteousness is indicated there, and his righteousness was in fact understood and expressed in a stream of extra-biblical Jewish literature. The Wisdom of Solomon, for example, in chapter 10, verse 6, and chapter 19, verse 7. It was also recognized in the early church, the end of the first century, a writing known as First Clement. We see Lot being understood as righteous. And it's interesting to me, you see how Peter emphasizes Lot's distress and his torment over the sin around him. He does that as a reflection of Lot's righteousness. You see, he sits here, righteous man, tormenting that righteous soul as he's in an environment that's sinful and wicked. Well, he's not somebody who just sits here casual, but doesn't care. That's them, it's not me. No, see, Peter cites the fact that he was tormented by the wickedness around him as an indication that he's a righteous person. That is the reaction of righteousness in the midst of wickedness. Now, in America, no-fault divorce, abortion, homosexual conduct, gender rebellion, and sexual immorality of all stripes. Those things have come to be accepted in our culture and in our country in the brief span of 5 or 6 decades. And rather than being distressed and tormented by this decadence, too many Christians have become insensitive to it and even accepted it and defend it as a valid personal choice. And you see how this works. Douglas Moo in his commentary says, this muted reaction to ever more rampant sin is fraught with danger not only for society but for the church. As Cardinal Newman, the 19th century Roman Catholic theologian, put it, our great security against sin lies in being shocked by it. He says, when we're shocked at something, we avoid it at all costs. But when sin loses its shock value, it can too easily become something we tolerate and then fall prey to ourselves. And don't think that the promoters, the anti-God forces in the society aren't aware of this. That is why, for instance, part of the homosexual strategy that was employed in the article that was written by Madsen, and I forget the other guy's name, laying out the strategy for capturing the culture. They said, speak of gayness loudly and often. Why? They understood this, that you just desensitize people to it, and it loses its shock value. And Moo adds that we don't find more Christians distressed by the sin that rages around us because, quote, we do not sufficiently share God's own horror at it. You see, and it is wicked and evil. And you just get immersed in it, and pretty soon you yawn at it. It's just no big deal. Now, the fact God knows how to hold the unrighteous for punishment until his chosen time, until the day of his judgment, it means that no ungodly people will avoid the judgment, even if they die before the Lord returns. He knows how to keep them, the unrighteous, for judgment. None of them will slip through the judgment net. That's not happening for any of them, however long it takes for that day to come. He knows how to hold them for the day of judgment. And he adds that this is especially true of those who indulge in sins of the flesh and despise authority, referring to the false teachers. So again, there's every reason for his immediate audience, and therefore for us, there's every reason for his immediate audience to continue to resist the false teachers' lure, their encouragement to join them in immorality. Because he's saying that None of them are going to escape the net. There is going to be no tear in it. There's going to be no loophole. He knows how to hold them for judgment in that day. And the examples of God's judgment of the ungodly in the flood, and the example of his judgment in the incineration of Sodom and Gomorrah, those are well-known biblical occurrences, okay? So he gives three things. He gives the angels in Tartarus, he gives the flood, he gives Sodom and Gomorrah. The flood and Sodom and Gomorrah, those are well-known biblical occurrences, but his casting of sinning angels into Tartarus to be held for judgment in verse 4, that's not described in Scripture. At least not explicitly. That's not spelled out. That's not revealed there in Scripture. And since Peter obviously assumes that his audience knows and accepts what he's saying here is true, right? That's his if-then formula. If this happened as you know it did, if the flood happened as you know it did, if Sodom and Gomorrah were incinerated as you know they did, well then these things follow. Okay, so he's obviously, this is something, the group he's writing to understands that when he says this, yeah, that's right. Okay, that happened, that's true. But it's not spelled out. But his audience knows, so there's something that they know. There is a story that they know, they're familiar with, something that is widespread and carries weight. They are familiar with it, and they accept it as true. Well, what is it? Now, some people think it's a reference to the initial fall of Satan and other angels that can be inferred from the fact, well, God created all things good, now we have things evil, so they were created good and some fell. I think that's right. But I think it's far more likely that in the context of first century Judaism, it's far more likely that Peter is referring here to a subset of fallen angels. Those fallen angels who were confined to Tartarus in distinction from other fallen angels who were not confined to Tartarus. Now, regarding Tartarus, Michael Green in his commentary says Tartarus in Greek mythology was the place of punishment for the departed spirits of the very wicked, particularly rebellious gods like Tantalus. Just as Paul could quote an apt verse of the pagan poet Aratus, Acts 17:28, so could Peter make use of this Homeric imagery. And this word Tartarus, it's used in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, done in the 3rd century BC. This word Tartarus is used in Job chapter 40, verse 20, and in Proverbs chapter 30, verse 16, for some kind of netherworld or realm of spirits. So it is it is a kind of spiritual prison. That's how it's being used here. And as the vast majority of commentators conclude, now when I say that, okay, I understand that commentators are not inspired. Do you not know that I know that? I do know that. But it is significant when you're wrestling with things if you have across a theological spectrum people of all differing theological perspectives who come together on it's a signal to you that there may be grounds for concluding that. Okay? Now, you are free to reject those things, but if you do, you need to have good ammo for it. Okay? Because you have to accept and respect that many people across a spectrum have come to the same conclusion. They have a reason for that. They didn't do it just to bug you. They came to that conclusion for a reason, so you have to delve into all of those reasons, and then if you want to challenge those reasons, that's fine. That's what publications are for. Okay? But so I just say that because I know sometimes when I refer to commentators, I don't like commentators. And I say to people, well, you're listening to me. What do you think I'm doing? I'm sitting here wrestling with text and trying to explain to you how I understand it. I'm giving you my best shot at it. Okay, well, that's what people do. And as I think I was telling Linda recently, I said, I for like $60, $80, I can go buy a commentary that somebody spent 10 years working on. 10 years. That's just on the commentary, not paying attention to all the years he worked to be trained enough to be asked to write the commentary. Okay, so I'm trying to learn, but I'm trying to learn from everybody I think knows something. All right, so that's why I cite that. But anyways, the vast majority of commentators conclude Peter is probably here alluding to a traditional Jewish understanding and elaboration on Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 4. And according to that understanding, the sons of God who are referred to in Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 4, a phrase which is elsewhere used to refer to angels. Okay, according to this ancient Jewish understanding of Genesis 6, 1 to 4, the sons of God refers to certain angels who married and procreated with human women and who consequently were confined to a dreadful spiritual realm awaiting final judgment. Now, I know that blows your mind, but just hang on, okay? That was a common Jewish understanding of Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 4. This was a widespread view. Not absolutely uniform, but it was a widespread understanding of that text in first century Judaism. That understanding is frequently reflected in extra-biblical Jewish literature of the time. Most notably, it is reflected in a writing known as First Enoch. Most notably there. And the book of First Enoch, that's significant because First Enoch is expressly cited by Jude in Jude verses 14 and 15. Okay, so we have this Jewish understanding that is reflected in extra-biblical Jewish literature of the time, most notably in First Enoch, and we know that Jude is familiar with First Enoch because he refers to it in his letter. So that's in fact significant. And since Jude knows First Enoch, and Jude speaks in verse 6 of his letter of an angelic judgment that is consistent with that referred to in that extra-biblical Jewish writing First Enoch, he very likely shared the understanding, at least in part, of Genesis 6, 1 to 4 that is reflected in First Enoch. And as Thomas Schreiner says, you remember in the introduction I told you that Jude and 2 Peter are connected. There's a question, okay? Did 2 Peter borrow from Jude? Did Jude borrow from 2 Peter? Or did they both have access to a third document or tradition? But either way, you see that these two, there's relationship between 2 Peter and Jude. And as Thomas Schreiner says, he says it's unlikely that Peter veered off in another direction from Jude, for regardless of the question of literary dependence, whether 2 Peter from Jude, Jude from 2 Peter, he says it's obvious that Jude and 2 Peter both drew from a common tradition in some form. Okay, so if we see that Jude seems to understand First Enoch and very likely shares the understanding of Genesis 6, 1 to 4 that's reflected in First Enoch, well then it looks like 2 Peter does also. Okay, 2 Peter does also. Now, if the angelic sin, if this is right, if the angelic sin to which Peter refers, if that is indeed based on this popular Jewish understanding of Genesis 6, 1 to 4, well then one of the things that you see from that is then the examples that he gives, they follow in sequence in the Bible. Okay, because then we have the angelic rebellion in Genesis 6, 1-4, followed by the flood, Genesis 6, 5 to 8:22, followed by Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 19. Okay, so then, we're in sequence in Genesis. We've got Genesis 6, 1-4, the angelic sin. We've got the flood. We've got Sodom and Gomorrah. So, that's nice. That makes some sense there. And Peter's wording echoes the language of the popular Jewish understanding. For example, in 1 Enoch chapter 10, verse 4, it speaks of a binding of a disobedient angel, hand and foot. So we have a binding here, delivered him into chains, and the casting of that disobedient angel into the darkness. And so here we have him talking about chains of gloomy darkness. So you have some sense here of language connections to that understanding of Genesis chapter 6, verses 1-4. And the dominant view, in fact, of the early church, no longer talking about Jewish intertestament, the dominant understanding in the early church of Genesis chapter 6, verses 1-4, was that text referred to angels who had sinned. According to Sidney H.T. Page, in his book Powers of Evil, a biblical study of Satan and demons, that view was held by Justin Martyr in the 2nd century. It was held by Clement of Alexandria and Tertullian in the 2nd century and early 3rd century, Lactantius in the 3rd and early 4th, Ambrose in the 4th. And Page says this view, that Genesis 6, 1-4 referred to angelic sin, he says this view held the field in the East until the early 3rd century. It's the Eastern Church until the early 3rd century, early 200s, and it was when it was rejected by Julius Africanus, and in the Western Church, until much later. So it wasn't simply something that says, well, this is a crazy Jewish interpretation, a crazy Jewish understanding. Now, if Peter is indeed referring to this popular understanding of Genesis chapter 6, verses 1-4 in first century Judaism, if he's referring to that, it does not mean that he or Jude endorses all of the understanding in the Jewish view of Genesis 6, 1-4. Right? He's under inspiration, putting his imprimatur on certain specific elements of that Jewish understanding. So we can't then say, well, then he approved of all. We don't know that. We only know what he expressly cites, and he expressly cites the elements that are useful for his purpose in writing this letter. So what we see here, he may only be endorsing that the angels, the angelic sin, this is what he endorses, the angelic sin and their punishment. So the angelic sin is their marrying, and in the Jewish tradition, their angelic sin is their marrying and procreating with human women. The judgment is they're being put in the spiritual jail of Tartarus. Now, he may only be endorsing those two things and saying nothing about how the angels pulled this off. How in the world did fallen angels marry and procreate with human women? He may be saying nothing about that. You see, because in the Jewish tradition, they did it by materializing, by becoming human. He doesn't say that. He doesn't tell us how they pulled this off. Nor does he say anything about their offspring being giants, as you find in the Jewish tradition. Nor does he say anything about the sin of the angels being responsible for the flood. He doesn't say that. So I'm just saying that you can't then bring everything in from the tradition. The fact he cites certain specific elements of the tradition. The two elements of that tradition he cites, the angelic sin, marrying and procreating with human women, Okay? That angelic sin and the punishment. All right, now, angels procreating with human women. That is certainly something that strikes us, rightfully, I think, as bizarre. Right? You're probably already going, this guy's lost his mind to even suggest something like that. But God, we know, he sometimes dispatches faithful, in other words, holy, righteous angels. He sometimes dispatches them in human form. But unless Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 4 is an exception, fallen angels, demons, never in Scripture become or appear to become physical so as to be visible to all. Okay? That never seems to happen as far as I can determine. Now, the serpent, you have the serpent in the garden. He clearly was animated by Satan, but that's different than a demon materializing as the serpent. The serpent, we are told, was a wild animal that God had created in Genesis chapter 3, verse 1. So somehow he's animated. He's moved, but he's not a demonic materialization. Okay? So that one's not one where we see a demon materializing. And the only other times that Satan or demons are seen are in visions. You have in Zechariah chapter 3, verse 1, Matthew 4, 9, and 10, and several places in Revelation in chapter 9, 12, 16, and 18. And the only time we're told anything about their appearance in these visions is in Revelation 9, where you have these nightmarish locusts and the fiendish cavalry. In Revelation 12, where Satan is portrayed as a great red dragon, and it's in Revelation 16, where the demons are portrayed as frogs. Okay, but these are visionary things. Now, in the popular Jewish understanding, as I said, in Genesis 6, 1 to 4, the fallen angels married and procreated with human women through materialization as humans. Peter or Jude, they do not say that. Okay, they do not say it. We say, well, if they don't say that, how can you be suggesting that they may be referring to that angelic sin as true? They're marrying and procreating. How would that be possible if they did not materialize as human beings? Well, I think it's possible that he's referring to demonic possession of human beings. In other words, that they married and procreated with human women by possessing men who married and procreated. That may have been sufficient for the demonic to satisfy their lust for human women. And I think there's lust for human women. It's suggested, at least in my mind, in Genesis chapter 6, verse 2, where it says, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive. Okay? So if he is in fact referring to this Jewish understanding that the sons of God are angels who sinned by marrying and procreating with human women, I think you don't have to go with, well, then I'm going to take the rest of the Jewish tradition that says they did so by materializing as humans. I think it makes more sense to say they did so by possessing existing humans. In other words, it was a matter of demonic possession rather than demonic materialization. Okay? Here's what Page says. The New Testament portrays demons as longing to possess human bodies, and one could understand what happened in Genesis 6 in terms of spirit possession. William Cook, in an article published a couple of years ago, titled, Who Are the Sons of God in Genesis chapter 6. Now you understand when I'm saying this, you can argue about this. Okay? You understand that. There's plenty of disagreement. I'm sharing with you what makes the most sense to me. Okay? So here's what Cook says in that article. He says, admittedly, these passages don't provide a definitive answer as to how spiritual beings could have sexual relations with women. But in light of examples we see in the New Testament, it seems best to assume that these evil spirits took possession of the bodies of wicked men and used them for their own sinful purposes. The New Testament gives us clear examples of demons and even Satan himself indwelling human beings and causing them to act in horrific ways. So if it's right that Peter is in fact, because whatever he's referring to, it is a well-known and accepted story. There has to be something we can trace and say, well, what is that story? When we go back and try to find out what could he be referring to? Well, it looks like he's referring to this angelic sin. Well, in that case, he's putting the divine imprimatur on that aspect of the understanding of Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 4. Now, Jesus' indication, when you say this, people say, what about Matthew 22:30? Jesus' indication in Matthew 22:30 that angels in heaven, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, that doesn't necessarily conflict with this angelic understanding of Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 to 4. Jesus may be referring only to faithful angels rather than fallen angels, rather than unholy or demonic beings. He may be referring only to what happens in heaven rather than to what happens on earth. And he may be referring only to actions that are not carried out through possession of human beings. All right, now that's a lot. But let me just say this. Whoever these sinning angels are, right, it's clear he's using them. There are sinning angels who are confined to Tartarus. So that's clear. The story is known. It's known to Peter's readers. And these sinning angels have been thrown in a kind of spiritual jail. That's what Peter is using, because he's saying, listen, from that if, he then is able to give a then, and the then is God knows how to hold the unrighteous for punishment in the day of judgment. Okay? So he's saying, just as he's able to take these sinning angels, however you conceive of their sin, I've given you an idea about that. But he takes these sinning, and they're confined to Tartarus, and he says, you see, he can hold the wicked until it's time. So no wicked are going to slip through the net. Therefore, people to whom I'm writing, do not be lured into becoming wicked by what these false teachers are selling you. You stand firm. You have every reason to resist their appeal to you to join them in immorality. All right, verse 10, that time went fast. All right, second part of verse 10 to 16. Brazen, arrogant men, talking about the false teachers. Brazen, arrogant men, they do not tremble when they revile glories. Whereas angels, though being greater in strength and power, do not bring against them a reviling judgment before the Lord. But these men, like unreasoning animals, creatures of instinct, born for capture and destruction, reviling those about whom they're ignorant, will also be destroyed in their destruction, suffering harm as wages of unrighteousness, considering indulgence in the daytime a pleasure. They are blots and blemishes, indulging in their pleasures while feasting with you, having eyes full of desire for an adulteress, and that do not cease from sin, enticing unstable souls, having hearts trained in greed. They are accursed children, abandoning the straight way. They've gone astray, having followed the way of Balaam, son of Bosor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness, but had a rebuke for his own transgression, a speechless donkey, speaking with a human voice, restrained the prophet's madness. I wish I had more time because I know what's going to happen right here, but hey. All right, the false teachers, they are so arrogant, so cocky, they do not fear when they blaspheme or revile glories, meaning when they mock or ridicule or belittle or speak contemptuously of those glories. Now, it seems clear, as most commentators recognize, that glories here, it refers to some kind of angelic being. Where he sits here and says they revile glories. It seems clear that it refers to some kind of angelic being, though angels, they're not referred to in the Old Testament as glories. Angels are linked with glory, and they are in fact referred to explicitly as glories in extra-biblical literature. Okay, so not in the Old Testament they're referred to, but they're linked with glory, and they are referred to as glories in extra-biblical Jewish texts. Now, it's less clear. So I think it's clear he's talking about angelic beings. It's less clear, though, whether he's referring to, whether glories here refers to fallen evil angels, demons, or whether it refers to holy, righteous, good angels. Now, some think, well, it can't refer to fallen angels because fallen angels could not qualify for the label glories. Okay? Now, people that think that, perhaps as many believe, the label reflects the glory of their original state, rather than rather than saying anything about their present condition. In other words, they have fallen from glory. So maybe it refers to that. Now, in Jude, if you remember this, in Jude verses 8 and 9, the archangel Michael, he is contrasted with the false teachers, in that the false teachers are there said to revile glories, whereas Michael, on the other hand, refused to bring a reviling judgment against Satan. He refused to bring a reviling judgment against Satan, saying instead, "The Lord rebuke you." Now, given that relationship, right, of 2 Peter and Jude, the statement in 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 11, that angels do not bring a reviling judgment against them, well, that most likely, in my judgment, it most likely means they do not bring a reviling judgment against fallen angels, of which Satan is chief. Right? I mean, that's what he said, and Jude said about Michael. Michael doesn't bring a reviling judgment. Unlike the false teachers who revile glories, Michael does not bring a reviling judgment against Satan, the chief of demons. So this is what I think he's talking about here. Now, that then say, well, what's going on? I'm lost. Well, if the bell hadn't rung, I really would like to explain what is he saying then in 10, the second part of verse 10 and 11. Okay? But that's just how bells go. All right, thanks for coming.